For more than 2 decades, Tom Brady lived inside a story the world believed was perfect. Championships came and went.
Losses that get recorded in history books. Losses that coaches dissect on whiteboards, that commentators replay frame by frame, that fans debate across decades. And then there are the losses that never make the highlight reel. The ones that don't happen under stadium lights, that aren't measured in yards or points, that no championship ring can ever erase. Tom Brady won 7 Super Bowls. He outlasted franchises, defied age, rewrote every record the game had ever written. But at 48 years old, in a quiet moment far removed from the roar of any crowd, he finally said something that no trophy had ever prepared him to say. He admitted that the greatest loss of his career had nothing to do with football. When Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen married in February of 2009, it felt less like a wedding and more like a convergence of 2 worlds that weren't supposed to overlap. He was already being spoken about in the same breath as the greatest quarterbacks who ever played the game, disciplined, obsessive, relentless. She was the highest paid model on the planet, a global force who had built an empire on her own terms. Independent, powerful, at the absolute height of everything she had worked for. To the world watching, the pairing looked like perfect symmetry. Ambition meeting ambition. Fame softened by genuine devotion. For years, that image held. Magazines ran photos of a family that looked effortlessly whole. Interviews painted a portrait of 2 people who had somehow managed to navigate the impossible. Elite careers, children, stability, and love all at once. But behind that image, a different truth was quietly taking shape. Brady's life ran on a calendar that never truly ended. Football wasn't a job with hours. It was a framework that structured every single day of the year. Training camps began before summer arrived. Seasons stretched deep into winter. The off-season, the stretch of months people assumed was rest, was, for Brady, simply preparation under a different name. Pre-dawn workouts, film sessions that bled past midnight, business meetings folded into physical training, travel that took him away from home for days and weeks at a stretch. This rhythm did not soften when they became parents. It intensified, and Gisele adapted. Not because she had to, but because she believed in the life they were building together. She stepped back from campaigns at the height of her career. She turned down opportunities that would have taken her across the world. She relocated multiple times, uprooting her life to anchor theirs wherever Brady's contract demanded. She became the center of the household, the parent who handled the invisible architecture of daily family life. The routines, the school pickups, the emotional presence that children need and that rarely gets acknowledged in public. She told herself it was temporary, that football, like everything, had to end. And when it did, the life they had quietly promised each other would finally begin. But years passed. Children grew older. And that promise, the one that said balance was coming, started to stretch in ways that couldn't be explained away anymore. The absences weren't easier to excuse. The emotional weight she had been carrying didn't lighten. And somewhere in the distance between what had been promised and what was actually happening, resentment began to take root. Not loudly, not explosively. The way these things always grow, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. This wasn't a marriage falling apart over one argument or one bad season. It was a marriage quietly suffocating beneath years of imbalance that was never corrected. Long before lawyers were involved, before rumors started leaking, before the word ultimatum appeared in tabloid headlines, Gisele Bündchen did something far quieter and far more devastating. She wrote a letter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't read like an accusation. It read like the truth from someone who had been holding it too long and could no longer pretend otherwise. In that letter, she told Tom Brady what no victory lap could drown out, that the marriage wasn't working for both of them, that she felt, in many ways, like she was raising their children alone, that the relationship had been built around one person's priorities, and the other person had been slowly disappearing inside it. She wrote about her own dreams, the ones she had deferred year after year, trusting that sacrifice was temporary and that eventually something would be shared equally. When Brady later reflected on that letter publicly, he didn't minimize what it said. He described the experience of reading it as brutal. And he said something that stopped people cold. He still has it. In a drawer. He reads it sometimes. Not as a monument to what he almost lost, but as a record of what he was warned about losing. At the time, Brady responded the way people often do when confronted with a truth they're not ready to face. He made promises. They entered counseling. There were conversations about change, about the future, about football ending and real life finally beginning. And for a period, it seemed like the warning had been heard. Then came February 2022. Brady announced his retirement. After more than 2 decades in the NFL, he said he was stepping away to focus on what mattered outside something. That hope lasted exactly 40 days. When Brady reversed course and announced he was returning for another season, the reaction inside the marriage was immediate. And it wasn't about football. It was about trust. It was about the conversations that had already happened, the plans that had already been made, the future that had already been discussed. To Gisele, the reversal didn't just mean another season. It meant that when the moment came, when Brady had to choose between intention and instinct, he chose the field. Sources who knew them described that moment as the point of no return. Not because she resented football, but because the decision had been made without her, unilaterally, without consultation, without even a conversation. Everything the letter had warned about, the pattern of one person's priorities silently overriding the others, had just been confirmed in the loudest possible way. From that moment forward, the marriage moved toward its ending. Not with a bang, with distance, with exhaustion, with 2 people realizing that love, however real, cannot hold together a life built on fundamentally incompatible priorities. The 2022 season should have been a homecoming. Brady returning for one final chapter, cementing a legacy that was already beyond argument. Instead, it became the most painful professional stretch of his life, and for the first time, the camera couldn't hide it. From the outside, he still looked like Tom Brady, composed, professional, going through the mechanics of the game that had defined him for 23 years. But people who worked alongside him noticed something different almost immediately. The obsessive precision that had been his hallmark, the relentless standard he held himself and everyone around him to, felt dulled. His patience was thinner. He seemed divided in a way that hadn't been visible before. In August, he quietly left the team for nearly 2 weeks. The official explanation was vague, personal reasons. No one pressed too hard, but the timing made the context clear to anyone paying attention. As the season wore on, the distance between Brady and Gisele stopped being a private matter. They were living separately. She stopped wearing her wedding ring. Reports surfaced of arguments, of divorce attorneys being consulted, of a marriage in the final stage of unraveling. Every loss on the field arrived with a fresh wave of speculation off it. And Brady was absorbing all of it, the professional pressure, the personal collapse, the weight of a decision made 40 days too late. The physical toll became visible in ways that were uncomfortable to watch. He lost a noticeable amount of weight. His face looked gaunt in press conferences. Former teammates and staff members later described scenes in the locker room that were quietly unsettling. Brady sitting alone after games, still in full equipment, staring at the floor. Not angry, not emotional, just empty, in a way that was harder to witness than rage would have been. This wasn't an aging athlete managing decline. This was something else entirely. A man trying to hold together 2 versions of his life that had finally stopped being compatible. Brady himself later described that season as shaped by personal turmoil that took a lot out of him, that it had genuinely impaired his ability to perform at the level he had always demanded of himself. And perhaps most tellingly, he admitted something even more revealing. For the first time in his career, football was no longer an escape. It had become a mirror. And in that mirror, all he could see was what he was losing. By the time the season ended, the paperwork had already been filed. It was finalized in late October 2022. 13 years, 3 children, a marriage the world had watched, idealized, and believed in, ended quietly, on paper, in a single day. There was no courtroom drama, no competing narratives fought out through lawyers and press releases. Both Brady and Gisele released brief, measured statements. They spoke about their children, about mutual respect, about moving forward. What they didn't say was louder than what they did. Months later, Gisele broke her silence in her first major interview since the divorce. And the way she framed the ending reframed everything people thought they understood about it. She didn't describe it as a betrayal. She didn't assign blame. She described it as a loss, the kind of loss that doesn't come with a clear villain or a single decisive moment. She called it, in her own words, something like a death and a rebirth. She spoke openly about mourning not a person, but a future. A dream she had held onto for years and had finally, painfully, let go. She pushed back, firmly, but without bitterness, against the narrative that had followed her since the unretirement reversal. The idea that she had pressured Brady, that she had issued an ultimatum, that she had forced an impossible choice. She called that framing deeply unfair and untrue. Football, she explained, was only symbol, one piece of a much larger and more complicated picture. The real story, she said, was simpler and more human than any of the theories. They had grown apart. When they met, they wanted the same things. As years passed, those paths had slowly diverged. And loving someone, she said, doesn't mean holding them inside a life that no longer fits them. It means allowing them freedom, even when that freedom leads them somewhere you can't follow. She spoke about Brady with warmth. She said she wanted him to be happy. She meant it. What had been lost, she explained, wasn't the love, it was the shared vision. The foundation that love needs to build something lasting on. She moved forward. She returned to modeling. She spent time in places that gave her peace, particularly Costa Rica, where she found a slower rhythm that felt more like herself. She focused on her children. She described co-parenting as a shared responsibility with no winners and no losers, just two people committed to the same people who needed both of them. Brady stayed quieter. But the reckoning was coming. After football ended for the final time, Brady pivoted the way public figures do when they're trying to reshape a narrative. Broadcasting deals, business ventures, high-profile appearances designed to signal that he was fine, that he was in control, that the next chapter was already underway. Then he agreed to the comedy roast. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable choice. A celebration of his career. A chance to demonstrate that he could take a joke, that the legend was human enough to laugh at himself. The format seemed manageable. He had survived things far harder than a comedian with a microphone. What he hadn't accounted for was the content. Comedian after comedian leaned into the divorce. They joked about Gisele leaving him. They reduced years of shared pain, of private conversations, of a family being restructured, to punchlines. Brady sat there and smiled, because that was the agreement. That was the format. You don't walk off the stage at a roast. But the damage didn't happen on the stage. It happened the next morning. When he spoke to his children, he learned they had seen the clips. They had watched strangers laugh at their parents' marriage ending. They asked him why he had allowed it, what it was for, what it was supposed to mean. Brady later described that conversation as a stake through the heart, not because his children were angry, but because they were disappointed in him. And for a man who had built his entire identity around preparation, around control, around never being caught without an answer, having no answer for his own children was something he couldn't train his way out of. He said he regretted it immediately. He apologized privately to Gisele for letting the jokes happen in that way. But apologies don't reach back and protect children from things they've already seen. That was a lesson that no playbook had ever covered. It forced him, for the first time, to sit with something he had been circling around for years. Not just the end of his marriage, but the accumulated cost of 1,000 smaller choices. The holidays he had missed. The milestones that had passed while he was in a film room somewhere. The ordinary Tuesday evenings that don't make headlines, but define what a childhood feels like from the inside. He had chosen, again and again, the field. And the field had eventually taken everything it could. At 48, Tom Brady finally spoke without the armor. Not as a brand. not as a franchise, not as 7 rings and a legacy that rewrote the record books. As a father looking back at a life that had been extraordinary in every measurable way, and quietly, privately, devastatingly incomplete, he acknowledged that his final season had been shaped by personal turmoil in a way he had never experienced before. He said that it affected his ability to play, to focus, to keep going. He admitted that after 23 years, what he felt when he finally walked away wasn't unfinished business. It was grief for time he couldn't recover. In a message to the people who had followed his career, he tried to frame his choices as a lesson in commitment, in discipline, in sacrifice, in showing his children what it means to dedicate yourself fully to something you love. And somewhere inside that message, almost quietly, came the line that said everything he hadn't said before. Your actions reflect your priorities, and no one is perfect. For someone who had spent a lifetime treating imperfection as a problem to be solved, those words landed differently. They weren't a confession of guilt. They were something more uncomfortable than guilt. They were understanding, hard-won, late-arriving, and impossible to act on. Gisele had already moved on, quietly, without fanfare. She had rebuilt a life centered around the things that had always mattered most to her: presence, honesty, family. She remarried. She welcomed another child, not as a statement, as a continuation of the life she had always wanted and had waited too long to choose. Brady received that with grace, outwardly. He focused on co-parenting. He spoke about her with respect. But the contrast was difficult to ignore. One person had rebuilt the dream. The other was still learning what it meant to live without one. Tom Brady, one more